family mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on vendor invoices. My name's Brad and I'll be hosting the webinar today. As always, if you feel need to leave the webinar early or you have missed any of our webinars in the past, you can always go to our brand new help center, knowledge.designmanager.com. Right here, where you can easily access all of our previously recorded webinars and review them at your leisure. If you have any questions today during the webinar, feel free to input them into your questions panel on your GoToWebinar pane along the side of your computer. If it's a question that doesn't pertain to vendor invoices or outside of the scope of our discussion today, feel free to email them to support@designmanager.com. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be discussing entering one of the most important, if not the most important, transactions for your vendors, the vendor invoices for completed goods and services. The other prominent vendor transactions, vendor deposits, which are prepayments to the vendor necessary for them to begin processing an order, or progress payments as the order is being placed, and operating expenses, which are used to record general company expenditures such as rent or mortgage payments, phone and internet, etc., will both be discussed under separate webinars to give each type of transaction the proper attention. As usual, we're going to be using examples in both Design Manager and Design Manager Professional, and if you'd like to see a function in one platform or the other, feel free to input that into the questions pane, and I'll be happy to do so at a stopping period. So, vendor invoices. In accrual accounting, which is the recommended accounting model for interior design firms and the model that Design Manager employs, invoices, both the invoice you generate for your client and the ones you receive from your vendor, are the force that powers the whole accounting model. The vendor invoice, or the bill you receive from the vendor for goods and services requested via purchase order, are the transactions that ultimately record the cost of the purchased products into your company accounting. The vendor invoice is also the physical, fiscal, and conceptual representation of the transfer of ownership of the goods from the vendor to your company. Let's take a brief moment to explore the accounting concepts behind the vendor invoice. When we record a vendor invoice for goods on a purchase order, by default, the cost of these goods first go into the work in process asset account. If we look at our account glossary, here's our chart of accounts, we can see we have our work in process asset account. It's an asset because technically our company owns or possesses those goods and services. Likewise, the company information window on our Other Account tab, you can actually define what account you would like to use for your work in process account, if it is something other than the one the Design Manager comes pre-configured with, in this case the 17100 work in process account. The activity of that work in process account is also monitored on the work in process report. And as we can see, these are the goods, merchandise in this case, freight in the case above, that I have recorded the bills from the vendor, but I have not yet invoiced my client. The cost of these goods are going to remain on the work in process report and in the work in process account until I do that. In fact, until I invoice the client for those goods. At the moment the client invoice is generated, which in turn represents the transfer of ownership of the goods from our company to the client, the cost of the goods move out of work in process into the appropriate cost of goods sold account, which we can actually see on the work in process report. Well, which cost of goods sold account is used? That's determined by the combination of the sales category of the item, the component type, and the company default cost of goods sold accounts. Let's take a look at the Hilson Project Home item 5, the sofa, for example. We can see that the sofa is utilizing the furniture sales category, and my sofa itself is being classified as merchandise, as the component type. If I look at my furniture sales category, I can see that the merchandise cost of goods sold account is indeed going to be my 51,900 furniture account, which is precisely what's listed on the report. So I can see exactly what account I will be processing the activity into upon invoicing the client for the sofa. If I did not have a sales category associated with my item, if I in turn left that blank, Design Manager then defaults back to the company settings to determine what cost of goods sold account to use. If we look at our company settings, cost of goods sold accounts, there's a default account for each of our component types. And my merchandise is also set to the 51,900 furniture cost of goods sold account in this case as well, but I always have a backup or a default to rely upon to determine what cost of goods sold account I should utilize. We do have an entire webinar on sales categories and how all those accounts are utilized and configured. And if that is something you would like to review, again, go to our knowledge.designmanager.com and review that sales category webinar. Okay. With all the accounting preamble behind us, let's turn our attention to the mechanics of actually recording or entering vendor invoices. Of course, in a real-world scenario, we first need to have entered our specifications and made our purchase order prior to recording the bills for those goods and services. But as we have previously recorded webinars and tutorials for both of those topics, let's use some specifications and purchase orders that I've already created for our examples today to keep ourselves on schedule. Let's start with a very simple example first. Let's go to our documents in accounting, go down to our Carter's Brigantine Beach Home. Let's say we have a purchase order from Philip Jeffries for some arrowroot fabric. Let's imagine that we just received the bill and we want to record it so we can remit payment. In Design Manager, to record the vendor invoice, I can highlight the purchase order and hit the vendor invoice button, or I can conveniently right-click and do New Invoice or Bill from Vendor. Either way, it brings me right to the Vendor Invoice for Project PO window. And as you can see, a lot of the information is already recorded for us. All we need to do is finalize it. I already have my purchase order listed. I have my vendor displayed. And I'm ready to enter the invoice number. The invoice number is required, so if one was not provided by Philip Jeffries, you could use the purchase order number, you could use today's date, you could even use a description of the order, anything to uniquely identify the bill. I'll imagine that we got some random invoice number, the invoice date. I can search and select today's date. Upon tabbing out, notice that my due date is automatically calculated all the way to the 29th for me. Well, if I look at our Philip Jeffries vendor, on our defaults tab, I can see that I've already configured a payment due date of 25 days. So my terms with Philip Jeffries are a payment of approximately 3.5 weeks. So by filling it in on my vendor, I automatically calculate a due date for the bill. And that's very convenient. Let's go to our checking window. I can see my payment due date listed right on the list of bills that I still need to record payment for, and I can even tag or automatically select a variety of bills based upon the due date. So in this case, I would select anything that is due on or before today. You can see I quickly tag them as well. So the due date is a very convenient way to, one, monitor the bills and make sure you're paying them on time, and easily select the ones that are due on a given day. The transaction description entirely optional. If you've attended one of our webinars in the past, you know that I am a strong supporter of them, as I find them to be an invaluable tool when I go to review information that I may have recorded months or even years prior. And it could be something as simple as final bill for arrowroot. Now, all the qualitative information for the bill is entered. So we're going to turn our attention to ensuring that the cost information on the merchandise and services themselves precisely match what the vendor has charged. We'll review this information using the purchase order component grid and the vendor invoice totals in the bottom right corner. Let's take a look at our purchase order components grid. We have the reference number within the project, the type, merchandise, freight, etc., brief description, manufacturer's catalog number if one was entered, the purchase order quantity, the purchase order cost, the cost to date. This is going to list the sum of all vendor invoices that I may have recorded in the past for this particular fabric. So if I received a partial bill, etc., any vendor invoices, the cost of all vendor invoices previously recorded would appear right in my cost to date field. I even have some receiving information shown, and now I'm being displayed what Design Manager assumes will be recorded on this bill, and it always defaults the full purchase order quantity and cost on invoice. Basically, the PO cost less any cost to date will be the cost on invoice. My first reaction when I'm recording a vendor invoice is to look at the totals themselves. If the total does not equal the amount on the actual invoice from the vendor, we must make the appropriate changes on the vendor invoice window to make the amounts match. Let's imagine that the actual bill from Philip Jeffries is showing a total of, I don't know, $445 as the cost for both, because both the fabric and the freight came in a little higher than anticipated. I need to reflect that on my vendor invoice window, and doing so is quite easy. First, I want to change the cost on my fabric. I simply have it highlighted on my purchase order component grid, and I use the edit button as indicated by the pencil to bring me to the vendor invoice distribution window. And now I simply need to change the merchandise cost appropriately. And let's say it's an even $420. If I click OK, the cost on invoice increases appropriately. Let's say the freight came in a little higher as well at $25. Exact same methodology, edit the freight, change the amount, hit OK, and my cost on invoice is reflecting that change. Further, my totals are now matching with the vendor, what Philip Jeffries has charged me identically. And as they are, we're almost done entering our vendor invoice. All we need to do now is to indicate how we are planning to pay, or if payment was already processed, how we did pay. And we do so with the Pay With menu. We always have the option to pay via check. I'm going to write a check for Philip Jeffries. That's the default manner. But I could also select any credit card accounts that I may have configured. If we look at our chart of accounts again, under our liabilities, we can see a very special type of liability for our American Express called liability credit card. I can create an account for each credit card account that I may have a credit with, select the specialized liability credit card type, associate the vendor who I will eventually have to repay, and I can even optionally record the credit card number just for my use only. For each of those special liability credit card types, you'll have an option on your Pay With to utilize them. When Pay With Check is selected, also notice that the Pay Now button is enabled. So I can use the Pay Now button to indicate any payments that I may have used via handwritten check, if I didn't have time to want to process a computer check through Design Manager, if I did a wire transfer or I used my banking institution's automated bill pay, or if I used an ATM or debit card. I can record all of those types of payments with the invoice payment window and simply indicate the date the payment occurred and from which account I've reduced those funds. But in our case, let's actually process a check for Philip Jeffries. Simply click OK. And now we can see we have an invoice listed underneath our purchase order. There's our invoice number, our convenient transaction description, the date, and the total amount. Go to our checking window. On our pay bills, print checks, lo and behold, we see our Philip Jeffries vendor invoice waiting for us to generate a check. Let's take a look at what happened behind the scenes briefly. Let's pop over to our transaction search window where we can see a lot of the accounting that transpired with our vendor invoice. Go ahead and select vendor invoices, enter today. And there it is. Notice we have a credit or an increase to our accounts payable by the full $445, and we also have the cost of the fabric itself and the freight resting or residing in our work in process account. If we look at our work in process report, we can see those costs listed there as well. And if we look under Carter's Brigantine Beach Home, there is our $420 for the arrowroot and for the freight resting in our work in process account until we invoice the Carters, when the cost will then move out for the wall treatment into, pardon me, the arrowroot into wall treatment's account and the freight into the freight cost of goods sold account. Our accounts payable report is a listing of all of our unpaid vendor invoices, operating expenses, vendor deposits. And notice 4 entries here: America's Mattress, Baker Napkin Tubs, FedEx, Philip Jeffries. That matches our checking window precisely. So our aged accounts payable report is always an indication or a mirroring of the entries on our Pay Bills Print Checks tab of our checking window. Let's go ahead and generate a check for Philip Jeffries, and to do so is quite easy. Simply tag or select it and hit the Checks button at the bottom of the checking window. If you have multiple checking accounts or banking institution accounts, select the appropriate one on the checking account menu. I simply have a single cash checking account. When I select it, Design Manager grabs the next available check number for me and allows us to then go to the Print Checks window where I can physically print my check, position my check form onto my printer. Design Manager gets all of its pre-printed forms through a company called New England Business Supply, or NEBS, and you can contact them or contact us to get the information. If we hit the OK button, I'm going to generate a print preview of the check form itself. And I'm utilizing the middle check form where the check would actually print in the middle of the check document with a stub on the bottom and on the top, one for me and one for Philip Jeffries. Then I print this actually onto the check. Once everything prints out successfully, I'm ready to go. I simply close, accept the check run, and our entry for Philip Jeffries now drops off our Pay Bills Print Checks and is listed in the checkbook. Very simple procedure. And that's a quick summation of how we process checks in Design Manager as well. And if we look back at our accounts payable report, we can see that indeed our Philip Jeffrey entry is gone from here as well. Very simple first run of a vendor invoice. So let's start throwing in some more complexity into the scenarios. Let's take another example that has just a small twist. And let's use a purchase order that already has a vendor deposit recorded against it, as the vendor required some initial funds prior to processing the order. Let's hop over to the professional platform. And let's go ahead and say we have a purchase order for one of our Carter projects. Again from Philip Jeffries, from some hemp wall coverings. Notice that I've already sent a deposit of $360 paid on my American Express, and I'm expecting to have a balance due on the invoice from Philip Jeffries of $400. In Professional, all of the payables, vendor invoices, operating expenses, deposits, etc., all go through under Accounting, Bills and Invoices. Sort of one-stop shopping for all of our vendor transaction entry. Here, make this a little larger. We go down to the Add button and simply indicate what type of bill are we paying. And here are all of our selections. In our case, we're doing an invoice on project purchase order. Input the appropriate PO, and I could search for it off my purchase order glossary search, and there it is, and select. And I could, of course, type it in manually as well. And just like in Design Manager, vast majority of the work is already done for me. I've got my vendor displayed, got the purchase order displayed, invoice number is of course required. Go ahead and pop one in here. Invoice date. Today's date again is fine. Due date appropriately updates. Transaction description. Final bill for hemp wall covering. Again, any cost changes, updates, installation charges, etc. can all be entered using our purchase order component grid. But let's say that the costs for both the fabric and the freight are exactly correct, but notice that I'm applying a deposit in my totals region now. I'm reflecting that $360 that we saw on our purchase order window. If I had a reduction in cost, or if I had the freight, for example, was not being included on the purchase order, I always want to ensure, just like the costs themselves, that I'm applying or utilizing the exact amount of deposit as well. Again, the concept here being make sure that the costs of the goods and services, and just as importantly the totals themselves, match the bill in our hand precisely. In this case, let's say that we pay Philip Jeffries with our American Express. Upon selecting American Express, notice our Pay with Hand Check Wire Transfer button is disabled, of course, since we are indicating we're paying via American Express. Another handy feature, all of our information is correct. I'm ready to save our vendor invoice. If I have a stack of vendor invoices that I want to enter rapidly, rather than just clicking OK and then clicking Add again to create a new one, I can use the OK Add function, which would save our current vendor invoice, but also leave the vendor invoice window up for me so I can rapidly enter bills. So now I can select another purchase order to record the bill, etc. We can see the one that I have recorded is listed on our New tab, waiting for review and posting. In Professional, we always have to enter our bills and then post them as well. Do you wish to post purchases into 12/2014? Indeed we do. And upon selecting yes, we drop off the New tab and are now being displayed in our existing tab, which lists all of our vendor payables that we've entered for history. And from here I can make edits in case I have an error in my cost or invoice number, etc. Or I could even void the vendor invoice if necessary, and even view some accounting details. I can see which accounts I affected. Again, we're hitting work in process. We are alleviating or reducing our vendor deposit account, and we're putting $400 onto our American Express account. If we look at our reports, we can also see our work in process. And there is our hemp wall covering and our freight. Again, residing in work in process until we do indeed invoice the client. And lastly, since we paid via credit card, if we look at our Pay Print tab of our checkbook, we don't have an entry for Philip Jeffries. Why? We are now listed immediately on our credit card tab. So we never go through accounts payable. Rather, that liability goes directly onto the credit card account 2100 for our American Express. So similar concept. All we're doing in this case is showing how the vendor deposit can get utilized and manipulated appropriately when recording our vendor invoice. So now, let's really get a little bit more complicated in a much more real-world scenario. Let's move on to an example where we've received a bill for only a portion of the order, which is commonly the case. Let's jump back over to Design Manager. And let's say that we have, looking at our Pennington home purchase orders, we have a purchase order for Cravat that we've only received the hardware for this window treatment, not the fabric itself. So if I right-click and do New Invoice, or I could use the Vendor Invoice button, either way, again, we go right to our Vendor Invoice for Project Purchase Order window. And I've got lots and lots of entries on this purchase order for Cravat. Tons of fabric, tons of freight, tons of hardware. But in our example, let's say that we only got the bill originally for for the hardware itself. So let's go ahead and use the purchase order number as the invoice number for our example. Today's date is just fine. Transaction description, final bill for window treatment hardware. Now, I'm looking at my subtotals right away in amount due, and this is much higher than the bill that I've actually received because I'm only receiving a bill for the hardware as it shipped first. So, I need to remove the costs from all of the components that I'm not receiving the bill for, yet still have the costs for the hardware. The quickest and most convenient way is to use the Clear Cost button with a little broom icon on there. If I click it, I'll first be warned, are you sure you wish to clear all the amounts for the items on the grid? Yes. And notice that our Cost on Invoice column drops to 0 for all of our components. And I can then simply put back the cost for the hardware. So I'll go ahead and put in $72 for the brackets, 46 for the knobs, and 45 for the pole. And as I do, notice that our subtotal increases appropriately. Lastly, notice that on our vendor invoice window, there's an optional tracking information here as well. The tracking information can be reviewed and entered as frequently the user who's entering the vendor invoices receives the shipments, or at least knows the shipments have been received. So they have the ability to both monitor the order tracking information and even enter it themselves. Now that my subtotal and amount due of 163 match the bill from Cravat precisely, I'm ready to proceed. Go ahead, click OK, and there is our vendor invoice recorded and awaiting payment. Let's say that a few days pass and the fabric actually ships and some of the freight, and another bill comes in from Cravat. Well, you can enter as many vendor invoices as necessary on a purchase order to complete the order with the vendor. So I can simply add another vendor invoice, and notice for our hardware, our cost to date is indicated already. So our cost on invoice is 0 in all of the cases. So now all we're recording are the costs for the goods that we have not yet recorded the vendor invoice for. And if we go ahead and do so, final bill for fabric, freight, and click OK. Design Manager is warning us. It's saying this invoice deposit was previously entered on 12/4, etc., etc. Why is that arising? I have intentionally used the same invoice number as I did when I recorded the hardware. Design Manager will always warn you if an invoice number for a particular vendor has already been entered to ensure that you're not entering in duplicate invoices. So if you know that you're not, in this case I do, I can simply click OK to proceed. If I'm not sure that I've entered it before, I can hit cancel and review my work. And there is our second invoice for our Cravat fabric and hardware for the window treatment. So as you can see, as many vendor invoices as necessary can be recorded for a particular purchase order in order to complete the transactions with the vendor. Let's consider now the addition of secondary charges, such as freight, shipping, or installation, that may accompany a purchase order. In all of our previous examples, I included freight on the purchase order, but this most certainly does not have to be the case. You may simply make the purchase order for the merchandise and choose to record the freight as it comes in on the bills from the vendors at a much later date. Let's hop over to the professional platform and take a look at some of these examples. Let's take a look at our purchase orders for our Pennington home, and let's review purchase order 4 again on the professional platform. In this case, I have no freight with all of my fabric and hardware. So when I go to record the invoice, Bills and Invoices, Add, click I for Invoice for Project PO. Again, I could search if I wanted to, or I could type in the purchase order directly, quite conveniently, and here's all of my information. So if I received the bill from Cravat and all of the charges for the cost of all of the fabric and hardware are listed, but I may also have some freight charges as well. How can I enter those? Let's get our invoice number in, today's date, final bill for window treatment materials. If Cravat has broken out the freight on each of the pieces of the fabric and hardware, I could certainly enter in each one by highlighting and entering in the charged freight amount. As such, notice that my cost on invoice increased by the $21 appropriately. That would be quite handy. But more commonly, I may get a simple freight total for all of the pieces on this purchase order. Let's say that all of the freight came to $80. Well, I could manually go in and split it up for each of the items, or I could lump all of the freight onto one of the components. But Design Manager also has a feature that allows me to distribute that freight. So I could click on our Distribute Cost button, and I could input our $80. What is the cost for? What is the charge for? Is it freight, crating, installation, etc.? We'll use freight in our example. I don't have any freight listed, but I could add it to any freight, or I could replace the freight that's being shown. And how do I want to distribute it? Do I want it evenly, where it would take the $80 and take a portion for each of our 9 components? Or could I weight it against something, or proportionally distribute it? So let's say that I'm going to proportionally distribute it or weight it against the merchandise cost. So if we go ahead and hit OK, notice that our cost on invoice increases. And each component now has an additional proportional freight charge for us. So a very, very handy way to distribute a single freight charge against multiple components on the purchase order. One other point to notice on our vendor invoice window for Cravit is I'm showing a discount amount and a days to take that discount. If I look at the Cravit vendor on my defaults, I can see that I have a discount percentage of 2% if I pay via check within 15 days. Some vendors still certainly do that these days. They'd rather pay, get your money via check than put it on a credit card. So they might give you a little bit of a percentage off. So they'd rather take 2% off than lose 4% to American Express. So that can be input into your vendor payee. And Design Manager will automatically calculate that amount when we're entering in the vendor invoice. Taking it a step further, on our company information window, there is even a vendor discount account that I can configure and have associated on our other account tab. And this is a cost of goods sold account, which will actually be stored as a negative value, indicating that my costs are coming in less because of my discount. Let's see how that works. So if we go ahead, click OK for our vendor invoice, go ahead and post, and drop off our new tab, and go to our existing tab. There it is listed nicely. Now it's awaiting us on our checking window, Pay Print tab, and there it is. And if I generate the check within the 15 days, so basically the check date is less than today's date, or the invoice date plus the 15 days, in other words, by the 19th in this case, I'm going to receive a discount. You can see Design Manager's listing that discount right on our checking window. And we can see our check amount is for $844.27 when the original amount was $861.50. So Design Manager is automatically applying that discount for me. And you can actually enter in that discount yourself right through the checking window. If the vendor is giving you a particular discount for easy order, or they're applying a credit or a promotion, you can use that manually as well. When we accept the check, let's take a look at the accounting behind that transaction. We'll look at our disbursements or checks for today. You can see we are alleviating or debiting our accounts payable. We're crediting or reducing our cash, but we're also crediting or reducing this vendor deposit account. So my cost of goods sold for the entire company is going down, and that yields to a corresponding increase in my net income. So we just went through several of the most common scenarios in vendor invoicing, and vendor invoicing really is the driving force behind recording all of our company's cost of goods sold, and recording them properly is fundamentally important to keeping proper and accurate accounting. Most of the scenarios we went through are very, very common. I also tried to review some of the more underutilized features as well to ensure that we're not missing any of the hidden tips and tricks within the process. So stay tuned for additional webinars on the other transactions, vendor deposits, and operating expenses. And again, feel free to peruse all of the recorded webinars at knowledge.designmanager.com, as they're always out there for your convenience and your reviewing pleasure. And as there are no final questions, I'm going to thank everyone for joining our webinar today. I hope to see you again on future webinars, and I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, and have a great day.